In 1077, a Vietnamese general turned a river into the ultimate weapon and used it to make 100,000 Chinese soldiers disappear without firing a single arrow. This is the story of how one man's genius turned the forces of nature against an empire's greatest army. Picture this. It's 1077 CE, and the mighty Song Dynasty of China has set its sights on the small kingdom of Dai Viet, what we know today as Vietnam. The Chinese emperor believes this will be easy prey. After all, what could a tiny kingdom do against the military might of one of history's greatest empires? The Song Dynasty wasn't just any opponent. This was a superpower with advanced weaponry, sophisticated military tactics, and seemingly unlimited resources. They had already conquered vast territories and were now looking south, hungry for more land and tribute. Dai Viet, with its rice paddies and fishing villages, must have seemed like a simple conquest. But they had gravely underestimated both the Vietnamese people and one brilliant general named Ly Thuong Kiet. When the Song invasion force assembled, it was a sight that would have terrified any reasonable commander. Over 100,000 soldiers. Think about that number for a moment. That's more people than live in many modern cities, all armed and marching toward Vietnam. They came in multiple armies, approaching from different directions, with cavalry, infantry, siege engines, and enough supplies to sustain a prolonged campaign. Standing against this massive force was Ly Thuong Kiet, with approximately 30,000 Vietnamese troops. On paper, this wasn't even a fair fight. It was a massacre waiting to happen. The Chinese outnumbered the Vietnamese more than 3-1, and they had superior equipment and training. But Ly Thuong Kiet wasn't planning to fight a conventional battle. He was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't made of steel, it's made of water. Ly Thuong Kiet knew something the Chinese invaders didn't: the new Nguyen River, known today as the Cao River. To the Song commanders, it was just another water obstacle to cross. But to Ly Thuong Kiet, who had grown up in this land, who knew every bend and every seasonal pattern, this river was his secret weapon. You see, the timing of this invasion couldn't have been more perfect for the Vietnamese. The Song armies had arrived just before monsoon season, when Vietnam's rivers transformed from peaceful waterways into raging torrents. Ly Thuong Kiet understood the rhythms of his homeland like a musician understands a symphony, and he was about to conduct the performance of his lifetime. Instead of meeting the Chinese in open battle, Ly Thuong Kiet made a decision that must have seemed like madness to his officers. He would let the enemy come to him. More than that, he would invite them into what appeared to be the perfect crossing point along the Nguyen River. Working with the precision of a master engineer and the patience of a hunter, Ly Thuong Kiet began preparing his trap. His forces constructed hidden defenses along the riverbanks, not the obvious fortifications the Chinese would expect, but subtle modifications that would prove deadly when the time came. More importantly, Ly Thuong Kiet's engineers began working on the river itself. They built concealed dams and diversions, systems that could control the flow of water with devastating effect. These weren't massive, obvious structures that would alert the enemy. Instead, they were cleverly disguised as natural features of the landscape. The Vietnamese also prepared hidden positions in the marshlands and wetlands surrounding the river. These weren't permanent fortifications that could be spotted from a distance, but carefully camouflaged positions that would blend seamlessly with the natural environment. All the while, Ly Thuong Kiet watched the skies and felt the wind. He was reading the signs that every Vietnamese farmer knew by heart, the signs that told him exactly when the monsoon rains would arrive. When the massive Song armies reached the Nguyen River, everything must have looked perfect from their perspective. Here was a relatively calm waterway with what appeared to be an ideal crossing point. The Vietnamese forces seemed to be waiting on the far side, a manageable enemy that could be overwhelmed with superior numbers. The Chinese commanders probably congratulated themselves on their good fortune. They had found the perfect place to force a river crossing and bring their overwhelming numerical advantage to bear. Little did they know they were walking straight into the most ingenious trap in military history. As the Song forces began their crossing, spreading out along the river to maximize their advantage, Ly Thuong Kiet watched and waited. Timing was everything. Move too early, and the trap wouldn't be complete. Move too late, and the enemy might escape. Then, at the perfect moment, Ly Thuong Kiet gave the signal. His hidden engineers triggered their concealed water control systems. Simultaneously, as if summoned by the Vietnamese general himself, the monsoon rains began to fall. What happened next must have seemed like divine intervention to the terrified Chinese soldiers. The peaceful river they were crossing suddenly became a raging torrent. Water levels rose with terrifying speed, turning firm ground into treacherous bog and transforming manageable currents into deadly rapids. The Song armies, spread out across the river and the surrounding low-lying areas, found themselves caught in a nightmare. Soldiers who had been confidently marching forward suddenly found themselves up to their waists in rapidly rising water. Heavy armor and equipment that had been advantages in battle now became death sentences in the flood. This is where the genius of Ly Thuong Kiet's strategy became clear. He hadn't just used the river as a weapon, he had turned the entire landscape into a trap. The areas that had looked like solid ground were actually marshlands that became impassable quagmires when saturated with water. Thousands of Chinese soldiers simply vanished into the swamps and mud. Others, weighed down by their equipment, were swept away by the suddenly fierce currents. Those who managed to stay above water found themselves trapped on small islands of higher ground, cut off from their supplies and reinforcements. The Vietnamese forces, who knew exactly where the solid ground was and had prepared for these conditions, could move freely while their enemies struggled just to survive. It was like watching a well-choreographed dance, where one side knew all the steps and the other was stumbling in the dark. When the waters finally receded, the once mighty Song invasion force was shattered. Tens of thousands of soldiers were dead, missing, or too demoralized to fight. The survivors faced a harrowing retreat through hostile territory, harassed by Vietnamese forces who knew every path and hiding place. The psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating than the physical losses. How do you explain to an emperor that your massive army was defeated not by enemy soldiers, but by a river? How do you rebuild confidence in troops who had witnessed nature itself seemingly taking sides in the conflict? The Battle of Nguyen Nguyet River secured Dai Viet's independence and established Ly Thuong Kiet as one of history's most brilliant military strategists. More importantly, it sent a clear message to the Song Dynasty and any other would-be conquerors: Vietnam would not be easily taken. This victory demonstrated something profound about warfare and human ingenuity. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't in having the biggest army or the most advanced weapons. It's in understanding your environment so completely that you can turn it into an ally. Ly Thuong Kiet had proven that intimate knowledge of local geography, weather patterns, and seasonal changes could triumph over seemingly insurmountable odds. He had fought the perfect asymmetric battle, using his enemy's strengths against them and turning his own apparent weaknesses into devastating advantages. The Song Dynasty, chastened by this incredible defeat, never again attempted a major invasion of Vietnam. They had learned that some victories come at too high a price, and some enemies are more dangerous than they appear. The Battle of Nguyen Nguyet River stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of environmental warfare. Ly Thuong Kiet didn't just win a battle, he redefined what victory could look like. In an age of steel and strength, he proved that sometimes the mightiest weapon is the wisdom to work with nature rather than against it. This Vietnamese general had indeed made 100,000 Chinese soldiers disappear, not through magic, but through the far more impressive feat of human intelligence perfectly aligned with natural forces. It remains one of the most brilliant tactical victories in military history, a reminder that genius can triumph over might, and that sometimes the best way to win a war is to let the earth itself fight on your side.